here for 6th Friday Landscape Series. So before we start the presentation, I would like to say a few words about the esteemed guest speaker we have with us, that is architect Trishla Gupta. She is a gold medalist in Bachelor's in Architecture, winner in ICER Landscape Design Competition. She also got the opportunity to work on Pediatric Cancer Care Hospital for Project Starfish America and presented the same in Global Investor Summit that happened in Indore with all ministries of India present there. She has been chief graphic designer of Institute and has also designed two college magazines, Sanrachna. Currently, she is working independently as an architect, landscape architect, interior and graphic designer, and has already worked on a number of residential projects and its execution. So today she will be presenting her thesis work on topic landscape design for carbon sequestration responding to climate change, a case of Indore. And without further ado, I invite architect Trishla Gupta to present her work.
Thank you, Tushalika. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so there would be some noise in the background because it's a busy street, so children are playing and vendors are also there, so please excuse me for that. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I worked on the topic landscape design for terrestrial carbon sequestration responding to climate change, a case of Indore. And so I would be explaining you the whole thesis in three parts. So one would be the basics and how the site selection was done. Then the second part would be the site analysis, and third I would explain you I went about thinking the proposal. So today, to explain you guys my thesis, obviously the content would be there, but then I would also tell you the whole process of my thinking. So what was my thought process and how I actually went on doing this particular project. So let me begin. So I actually was reading and going through a few papers, and I came across the study by IPCC which says that climate change is widely acknowledged to threaten the well-being of human and natural systems. And at present, if you talk about cutting emissions and not creating more of the carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, it is not sufficient. Actually, whatever the carbon dioxide is present in the atmosphere, it is needed to be removed, and then we can keep the warming under few degrees, like 1.5 degrees. So for that reason, this actually struck me so as to how a landscape architect has a role to play in removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And digging deep into it, I then realized that the sequestration of carbon is one such possible solution which can remove and store carbon dioxide in carbon sinks and also has co-benefits for the human as well as the natural environment. So it was then I decided to take up this topic as thesis and study the same for my own city, the city of Indore. As when I was doing this particular thesis, it was the COVID time, so we actually preferred taking our own city for the ease of site visits and everything. So moving further, the main aim was to actually offset carbon for the selected region of Indore through carbon sequestration landscape design in order to enhance the adaptive capacity and resilience to climate change. So basically it wasn't so that I was focusing majorly on the climate change, but a small aspect of it which could actually help reduce climate change. So the major objectives were to learn about the presence of carbon in landscape, so where all the carbon is present and what all carbon emissions that we are doing, so how it is affecting and how is it a factor of climate change in various places and all over the world. Also to explore the effective assessment tools for accounting of carbon dioxide emissions and carbon sequestration. Now this was something very important that I focused on, because I feel that whenever you talk about polluted air, or when you talk about that the atmosphere is not good, So that becomes very subjective, and I felt that until and unless we are able to account for something, until and unless we are trying to get something in figures and numbers, then only we can actually say that yes, the air is polluted, or the carbon dioxide emissions in the air is more, or how so. And if we are talking about carbon sequestration, then what amount of carbon is actually sequestered by nature, by different processes, so how it is done. So that was something my major focus was on. Then, to know the phenomena of climate change in Indore, so I actually studied how climate change was being experienced by people, and also by different researchers who were doing researches here. They actually came up with different data that was there for the city of Indore, what was the present conditions and what were the future projections, and then to study the components of landscapes in urban context and their role in mitigating climate change. So this was something very important, because when we talk about the components of landscapes, so that varies in different kinds of settings, and for this reason it was important to study the components of landscapes that were particular to a urban context. Then interpreting the importance of landscapes to carbon sequestration, and then I proposed a design for the city of Indore in terms that are meaningful to design practice. And this was something that was kind more of a research based thesis that I was doing, but then I tried to actually implement it to a smaller area, a smaller region of Indore, so that the research which I did could actually produce a meaningful result. So this was some basic things that I went through, and so I began understanding the core concepts, which are like climate change, carbon sequestration, carbon offset, and the term carbon sequestration is reserved for the enhancement of natural sinks of carbon dioxide, a mitigation option for climate crisis. So to understand the topic even better, I did the literature review. I studied a whole lot of research papers, articles, videos, and everything. So, giving you a brief, carbon sequestration happens majorly through three processes. One is the biological, second is geological, and third is the technological process. And for my particular project, my focus was majorly on the terrestrial mode of biological carbon sequestration, which is through the soil and forest. Because if we talk about the biological, then there are even, so carbon sequestration happens in water, in soil, forest, and grasslands. So my major focus was on the soil and forest, how trees and soil has a role to play in it. Moving further, then I studied how terrestrial carbon sequestration happens. So that is actually a very natural process that happens, but the major focus was how we can enhance it. Then I went through various theories and frameworks which I have actually used further, so I would be explaining you later. Then few of the case studies. So basically the case studies which I chose were few for the accounting purposes. So one was how we could calculate the carbon emissions in the atmosphere through certain factors, through certain coefficients, which was already studied in China for the Yangtze River. And then there were case studies wherein I learned about how carbon sequestration accounting is done. So that was another thing. Then I looked into the landscape design for carbon sequestration, how ecological health and of soil and trees has to be maintained, and how it helps in increasing the carbon sequestration. And then I looked into the framework, which was actually applied here in the Silicon Valley. So I actually looked into the whole case study, how it is applied and how it has actually helped the city to again become vibrant with nature. So that was something I looked into. Site selection. For site selection, as I said, I was looking for the city of Indore, and here is the map. So if we look about why the carbon emissions are so high in the city, so it is the complete story of its history and development. So initially, it was the advent of Holkars, and after defeating them came the Britishers, who decided to promote Indore for commercial activities. And then came the development era, when Indore saw its industrial development, and now it is growing rapidly, emerging as a education hub, transport hub, as well as a logistic hub. So the growth of Indore has been organic and it has been very fast, because of which the transportation and commercial sector has actually exploded in the last 2 decades. So then I looked into the climatic data, and it is observed that the average temperature will rise by 2 degrees Celsius by 2050, which may extend the viability period of some disease vectors also, and the operation of cooling devices will also increase. So because of which the urban heat island effect and will increase and disturb the energy balance. Also, for rainfall, there would be an increase in 200 mm by 2050. So these projections are high and can increase the risk of flash floods in the city. And to understand the carbon emissions in the city, I calculated the net carbon emissions for the city of Indore according to the land use, dividing the city into different watersheds. So the areas marked in yellow have the least carbon emissions due to the presence of low carbon emitting uses and the high amount of green open spaces. This is followed by the areas in orange and then red, which have very high net carbon emissions, which is majorly due to the presence of industries, transport, settlements, and agriculture sector, and lack of open green spaces. So, out of the areas marked in red, I've selected the demarcated area for my further study because it is a very culturally and ecological important site, which was highly vulnerable. So till here we have got an idea about what was the basic topic and what is the site, how I went on selecting the site. So I just wanted to ask if anybody of you could tell me what areas do you expect to have more carbon emissions in the city? Like in the city we have some areas are highly residential, only residential, then some areas are commercial, then some areas are wherein you have more of a transportation thing. So what areas do you expect to have the most carbon emissions in the city? Can anybody just guess?
Industrial.
Industrial. Yeah. So industrial is the one which has the major carbon emissions. Although here again the same, this was the same case wherein the industrial area had the major carbon emissions, because here it was industries, airport, highways all at one place. Otherwise, in although the site was located in the peri-urban area of the city, but in many of the cities, because of the legal norms and everything, now they are actually cutting off the emissions in the industrial area technologically. So when the air comes out, it is not actually that carbon emitting. But here it was not the case. So here I found that the maximum carbon emissions were in this city, at this particular place. Also, I would like to share that here, this whole thing I calculated out of a formula and out of a case study. Although these things should actually be done by the government, by different, like wherever the calculators are there, it has to be actually measured, the carbon emissions. But since it was not here in the city, so I actually had to do that. But air quality index and everything is measured, but carbon dioxide is not included in those measurements. Moving further, when I talk about the site analysis, so this was the site wherein okay, so just give me a moment. So this is the study area wherein we could see the three major highways. So one is the Super Corridor, then the Airport Road, and the Indore-Pithampur Road. So there were three highways, and the site is dominantly covered with the agricultural land use, as you could see, and it lies in the peri-urban area of the city. So the site has the airport, industrial warehouses, residential settlements, and vacant lands as well. And there are also two major religious sites of the city. One is the Bijasan temple and the other is the Hinkagiri, which are on the hilltops, which were quite lush green forests before. So I did the geomorphology physiography study, wherein the whole area is under the inundation origin, except this particular takery. So here, earlier, this particular place was a plateau, but there was a severe erosion because of which the relief had become sharp, and the area is has the basaltic origin, and has the black cotton soil and lateritic soil. The soil depth here was very shallow, like 10 to 25 centimeters, and the soil texture was very clayey, because of which the soil organic carbon was also very low at this place. Now, soil is a component which is very which has a capacity to sequester carbon, and that has a very high capacity to sequester carbon. But here, due to various factors which I would be talking further, the sequestration of carbon by the soil was found very low, and out of this it can be inferred that the vegetation on the site was also very dry and scanty due to poor soil quality, depth, and low moisture content. Then these are few photographs which shows the relief of the place, and there are few vantage points. So actually it was not a hill, but yeah, there was some elevation at the place. Next, I did the slope, wherein almost all the slopes were found to be gradual to flat, and few areas were found to be 5 to 10%, which were moderate. And then I overlapped it, so the areas which you could see in yellow are majorly susceptible to erosion, because it was the vegetation was so scanty that the soil actually drained off. Then the hydrology, wherein the dendritic streams actually originate from the hilltops of this particular takery and flows down as a third order stream. So these are the images which evidently shows how the water is flowing and causing the gully erosion at the place, and the slopes and soil texture does not allow the water to hold and percolate beneath the soil, which in turn has an effect on the growth of vegetation as well here. Okay, so moving forward here, to study the ecology, I first looked into the vegetation present at the district of Indore, which is majorly at the southern part, as you could see. So there are majorly three types of vegetation found, which is dominated by the dry teak forest, and the forest showcases great diversity in trees, shrubs, and grasses. So then I tried to list the dominant species, which along with the critically endangered and endangered ones. So here is a list of non-timber forest producers also, which strengthen the community in the city. Now this study was important. Now the trees, why I studied the trees present in the city, because that was not present at the site, and there was something different, or I should say the majority of the vegetation was lost. So I had to study what all trees or what all species are actually possible at the site and which are not here. So that was the thing why I studied the whole thing. And so this section shows the structure of a dry deciduous forest. Then I tried to calculate the carbon sequestration of the species present in Indore. And the graph here shows that the 20 species with the highest carbon sequestration, and here is a list of the associated fauna that we could find. Then moving forward, I studied the vegetation at site. So majorly we could find three typologies of areas wherein substantial amount of sequestration happens. So that is the forest, agriculture areas, and roadside plantation. So specifically talking about the agriculture, the major crops grown here is soybean, wheat, maize, and chickpea. And these are annual crops which typically has lower root biomass, and majorly the sequestration process happens through the above ground biomass. Also, the process of tilling and harvesting, which is quite often done and very much in practice, is actually whenever this process happens, the stored carbon in the soil tends to get released back into the atmosphere. So it doesn't hold it for a longer duration. So it doesn't make sense. That carbon is getting trapped for some time and then again getting back to the atmosphere. So that is something not very efficient way of doing the process. Okay, then I looked into the reserve forest that was at the Ramna Bijasan Tekri. So I did the quadrant analysis for the same and realized that the hill is in quite a degraded state. The dominant species found here are also few in number. So there are no understory seen. Only well-grown trees are observed. The regeneration process here was also hindered by the stray animals and other anthropogenic activities. The soil structure was also disturbed. The majority trees found on site are I just have enlisted here, and here also the carbon sequestration potential I have listed. So which clearly shows that the amount of carbon that actually a healthy forest can sequester was not happening there because of such a degraded condition. So then I just did a very quick activity mapping to see what all things were there, and then I synthesized. So after overlaying all the layers, the major findings were the land uses and their respective carbon emission and sequestration potential. So here you could see the red marks, which are majorly the places of high carbon emissions, and there you could see the green marks, wherein you could see the places wherein majority of the carbon sequestration happens, which are quite low. So it was realized after I did a lot of calculations, and then I realized that to nullify the emission with the sequestration, an additional amount of about 1 square kilometer needs to be designated as forest areas. So 1 square kilometer as forest areas or as green areas or as a planted area needs to be there, which was lacking in the particular site. And if we do that, then only we could nullify the effect. Also, the rocky, barren, uncultivable lands and such studies which I did before, so that actually is marked so that I could plan it further where I could have a particular kind of plantation where I could not have that, which areas I need to actually cure before we plant anything else. So all such areas I have marked here, and so yeah, some vantage points were also seen, so that I've also marked. Then moving forward to the concept and proposal. So after I did the analysis, I designed this whole concept. So I realized that the soil health and vegetation is greatly affected, which are the major sinks of carbon. So I tried to combine these functionally diverse systems and socio-cultural aspect of the place to lower down the emission and hence increase the carbon sequestration. With the increase in soil microbes and fungi, soil ecological health will be improved. Then I applied the concept of urban forestry at different scales and land uses, which can enhance the carbon sequestration through the vegetation. Hydrological aspects also helps create better conditions for the soil and vegetation to excel. So all these three aspects would help in increasing the carbon sequestration at the place. Soil cultural aspect will help in reducing the carbon, socio-cultural aspect will help in reducing the carbon emissions through change in their lifestyles and behavior towards environment. And all the three concepts and their interrelationships that I framed are here, wherein I looked into the biological circuit, that is vegetation plus soil ecological health, then socio-cultural aspect and the hydrological aspect. And then I came up with a vision statement which says that to develop a carbon sequestration plan which enhances the carbon sinks and protects the natural environment with a balanced approach to the use of land and resources, which would in turn work to maintain the whole ecosystem. So then I actually tried to implement this particular framework which I was talking about before. So these are the 7 principles of landscape resilience, and beginning with the setting. So if we talk about the setting, I tried to identify the opportunities of creating or enhancing the carbon sinks, wherein forests, parks, forest parks and agricultural land falls in place. Then streams, roads and greenways provides connectivity to the whole area, which was the second principle, how do we connect the whole ecosystem. Then the areas are planned in different scales ranging from regional to local, which has varied potential to sequester carbon and repetition of which makes the system more redundant. So the other factor which was there was the redundancy and different scales. So if we are talking about carbon sequestration, it is not only about creating forest, but we have to look at different scales. So it begins with the pocket parks, it begins with the plantation at our place, it begins with how what kind of plantation we have at our residences, then pocket parks, neighborhood parks, then at the roadside, then what kind of plantation we have. So it is in different scales. How are we moving from a very single unit to a forest? So that has to be maintained at different scales for a city to actually look into how we can remove or reduce the carbon emissions at our place. Okay, so the diversity and complexity would be maintained through the vegetative diversity, which is another very important factor to increase the carbon sequestration. So the structure and heights will perform different processes and allow movement of organisms, and people here would play a major role in shaping landscapes, interacting with the environment in terms of how recreation happens. Conservation management would be done through people. So this will evoke a sense of ownership in its citizens. So all these layers I tried to overlap to create a carbon sequestration plan which defines different carbon sinks. Okay, so the proposal is majorly based on these 6 aspects. There is an attempt to restore forest areas, extending it to the agroforestry, which would provide food security and other benefits to environment and community. Then the barren lands, which I had marked before, would be revived in stages, and once it is in good shape, it would be developed as a park, which would be the face of Indore. Then various neighborhood parks are delineated. Here you could see the small parks which are there in the city. These small parks, they actually need to be naturalized, and these all are connected through the streams, which needs to be revived by providing the strong buffer areas. Then the roadways needs to be redesigned with better medians and side plantation, which is a great carbon sinks and would also help in stormwater management, which is quite weak at the place. Then there are institutions which have sports fields and other landscapes which would sequester carbon. Carbon sequestration does not limit to afforestation. Management and installation plays an important role in reducing the emissions, which could be best handled through engaging communities and such practices. So this was the major concept that I came up with, because at the whole site there were different kind of areas which I focused on, and I tried to see how we could connect those things, and I applied all the principles that we discussed before, like the setting, connectivity, redundancy, diversity, then how people would come in play when we are talking about the whole plan. So moving forward, when we talk about the soil, looking in depth, I realized that all the areas have a common problem of soil quality, which was not really good at the place. So one was the erosion, and the other are the degraded barren lands which were there. There is hardly any soil. So to increase the soil carbon sequestration, increased microaggregation and deep incorporation of soil organic carbon is very important. And here the slopes are not very steep, so therefore mulching and plantation should work for the stabilization process. For barren lands, use of biochar and concepts of agroforestry needs to be applied, as this itself has a great potential of carbon sequestration. Further, when I talk about the forest, so they have more carbon sequestration potential at the younger stage. We think that it has more at the later stages, but that is not very true. Forests have more carbon sequestration potential at the younger stage. It is important that once a forest reaches its mature stage, wood residue and other such elements should be removed from the surface. Also, it is not advised to wait for the regeneration to happen, but planting should be carried out regularly to increase the process further. The design aspect of it is discussed through these sections. So taller trees and deep roots, stratification, functional diversity of the plant, and increased biodiversity supports high amount of carbon sequestration in healthy ecosystem. So here I tried to show what kind of an existing section was there, and what was required to be done, and what kind of an ecosystem was required to actually increase the carbon sequestration at the place. And when we talk about the agriculture, there are few practices which includes like the biomass production, humification, and other landscape management practices which can increase the carbon sequestration at other level. So I tried to demonstrate here the practice of cover cropping, and there would be an increase of 50% in carbon sequestration if we do cover cropping. There would be an increase. So here I actually tried to take a 1 meter by 1 meter of the patch, and then I tried to calculate the carbon sequestration there if we just grow one crop around the year. So that would be just 1.08 kg per year. But if we do cover cropping, there would be 2.16. So it was an increase, like it was doubled through the year. So that was something. So such practices needs to be actually incorporated, and I actually tried to. So the tree study and the sequestration study was done to actually look into the plants, trees, whatever have higher amount of sequestration potential, so that could actually be incorporated and used more at the places. Then the road sections need to be redesigned with swales and rain gardens that has great potential of carbon sequestration as well as stormwater management. Then I actually tried to do few other sections which shows the agriculture fields and stream buffers. Then if you could see the section D that depicts the open forest wherein the controlled harvesting would be permitted. Also this would provide a different experience for citizens. So here I tried to do few snippets showing the essence of different kind of places here. And here then the creation and enhancement of carbon sinks would lead to significant decrease in the net carbon emissions of the study area. So the different provisions given in proposal that I have talked about have likelihood to benefit the environment as well as community socially and economically. So I tried to create this particular chart wherein you could see the different provisions that I have talked about and what kind of an impact it would have at the environment, at the social level and economic as well. And as you could see the map here, you could so if you remember the synthesis map, you could see more of the red areas wherein more of the carbon emission was happening. But here if we bring a little change in the agricultural practices, if we try to recover the land, the forest which were there, if we try to revive the rivers by certain processes and methods that I've talked about, there would be definitely a kind of change that would uh, increase the carbon sequestration at the place. So climate change is a global issue, and all the countries are developing on the cost of their well-being. This starts from smaller areas, and every settlement and development and efficient planning of land uses with sufficient sink can curb those effects of carbon dioxide emissions, and the city can grow more sustainably. Carbon sequestration is an important concept that helps to reduce carbon emissions naturally. The only idea that you have to keep in mind is to maintain a healthy ecosystem that can enhance this process and the nature can perform better. So this was the whole idea that uh, I had worked into, so more of a research based thing, and these are few of the references that I referred to. So yeah, that's it from my side. You can ask me if you want to.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and there's a lot that we can learn from this presentation. So, anybody has any queries, please ask.
Okay, so I would ask you something like, was it clear to you, or the terms were going like you didn't get the terms or something like that, or you understood what was the major concept? Like because the first years are also here, so I'm not very sure they got the whole concept.
what you said in the beginning,
Can't hear you.
your voice is breaking. Trishla, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. I can't hear you.
Okay, sorry. I have one question. So you were talking about carbon sequestration, and you had also calculated the emission from those like areas, right? Like the airport and the industrial. So, do you also get into detail about what methods could be used to lower those emissions?
Okay, so basically, how there are few of the processes, or we could say few instruments that are basically installed. So how do the we calculate the air quality index and everything is done. So similarly, carbon dioxide emissions are also calculated, which are to be installed at certain places, and it actually covers a particular radius, out of which you get the amount of carbon emissions at that particular place. But since it was not there, the particular thing was not installed, and usually many of the cities in India are not doing that particular thing. So for that reason, I had to go with the another option of calculating through it through the coefficients.
Okay, yeah. So what my question was is, so you talked about like sequestering in different areas to like combat as a defense against that to negate it basically, right? So
Yeah.
what my question is what are the methods like to lower those emissions in the first place?
Okay, so see, if we talk about, if we are talking about the basically of the biological ones, then definitely the plants and soil plays that role, and that is completely natural. But what happens is, if the ecosystem is not well right in place, it will not happen that efficiently, and ultimately it will not result in that kind of a negation. So majority of the sequestration happens in the soil. So my current research is actually, I'm currently now working on how soil, the sequestration in soil can be calculated. So basically what happens, trees take up the carbon to them, and that carbon actually transfers through roots to the soil. So majority of the carbon is stored in the soil. So soil is the major sink of carbon, and that is done through vegetation. So if we don't have the vegetation, then soil does not have the capacity to capture it itself. So that becomes the medium of sequestering.
Okay. So, okay, let me reframe my question. What I meant was, like you're talking about sequestration in, like the greener areas, right? So I'm asking about what about the other part of lowering carbon in the first place, and not
Okay. So basically, when I was doing this study, there were two aspects that had to be handled. So one is to reduce the carbon emission, and another is to actually offset it. So one is by the socio-cultural behavior. So what happens is, whatever the carbon emissions we do by our daily things, so when we use many of the appliances, that emits carbon emissions. If we begin reducing that kind of an appliance, then that would be reduced. So all these behavioral or lifestyle changes we need to make to actually reduce the carbon emissions. Reduce means we are not emitting more. But my concern was more on how do we actually remove what is already present in the atmosphere, because I was working more on the landscape side of it. Obviously, the social cultural aspect is important, because if we keep on doing more of the emissions, then it's not going to actually reduce. So if we make changes in our lifestyle, that is major thing. But if you want to remove it, then there are the obviously I worked on majorly the landscape aspect of it.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I loved your graphics.
Thank you.
I have to ask something. I have a doubt. So basically, you were talking about the industrial areas, and I just wanted to know what happens when other pollutants comes, just like sulfur dioxide, which industry release and which have an effect on the soil. So how you're going to deal with that?
Okay. So here I actually do not have a very clear answer to it, because when I was initially taking up the topic, there were different things that I was looking into, but my major focus was on air. So when I'm talking about air, I was looking into the different pollutants in air, and then out of the air, the pollutants in air, I chose carbon dioxide specifically because carbon was a major contributor which was affecting or a factor for climate change. So that was my major concern of study. So if there are pollutants in the soil like sulfur dioxide, and as you said, then definitely that is somewhere going to affect the kind of plantation that is there at the place. But since my major focus was on carbon, I did not look deeply into that aspect.
Okay. Okay.
Anybody else have any questions? If not, then we can conclude this presentation. Thank you, Trishla, for the amazing presentation, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there's a question, just let me check.
Yes, there is.
Okay, so what are the other landscape interventions to mitigate climate change? See, majorly climate change is a very big phenomena if I talk about. So there are different aspects to it. So there cannot be a limited number of aspects. So when I'm talking about climate change, so climate change is related to increase in temperature, then it is related to rainfall and every other thing. So there are many things that is happening simultaneously, and for each one of those there are different causes for it. So there are different factors that is affecting that particular thing. So for that reason we actually need to look into different factors which are affecting the climate change, and for those factors we need to see how we can make interventions or mitigate it. Because so suppose for so in my case, when I'm talking about temperature rise or when I'm talking about rainfall, so when I'm going for deforestation, when I'm going for the naturalization of parks and everything, sequestration will increase, carbon sequestration will increase, so reducing carbon dioxide will definitely lower down the temperature. So that increase in temperature could actually lower down the temperature a bit. So in that sense, we are trying to mitigate. So here I was talking about carbon dioxide. If we are talking about soil aspect, if we are talking about rainfall, then obviously rainfall. So I said that there would be an increase in rainfall. There would be no percolation. There was no percolation happening. So if plantation would be done, definitely that would absorb more of the water underneath, and that cycle would be maintained better. So everything is connected naturally. So natural system, what my major focus was on trees and soil. That is something very common and very general to what we call natural system, that is to be actually working potentially in order to mitigate climate change. So we cannot, so there are n number of solutions that can happen to mitigate climate change. The only thing we need to see is what factor are we focusing at, and then we could actually look into the kind of interventions we are trying to give for that particular cause. So does that answer your question? Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, then we can conclude this presentation. Thank you, Trishla, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.